Welcome back. This is week 16, lecture 1. So what? What is justice or something like that? What is it? So what? Justice in a new brave world. Sorry about that. And this lecture is kind of a wrap up lecture. As I said in the last lecture to begin, the last lecture was the last, let's say, substantive lecture of the course. This is kind of an overview, looking back where we've been, where we are now, and then with an eye toward what's coming up, namely your final. The next lecture, which is the final session of the course, so to speak, is preparing for the final exam. And there I will be very directly talking about the final exam and going through the question and how to strategically go about preparing for it and then answering the question. Yeah, this lecture too is certainly related to that because this is the overview of the course, and your final, of course, is comprehensive. So this is designed to help prepare for the final as well. Even though, if there were no final, let's say, I would still be giving this lecture as a summation, so to speak, of what we've been through, and the whole kind of point to the course as I see it, as I have constructed it. Because the whole goal that I've had for this course is that you all will, quote unquote, get it at the end. And what do I mean by get it? I don't mean only learn a lot of information, which I hope you have along the way, and things you didn't know before. But far more importantly, the perspective and understanding of what this thing that has been called Western civilization really means. How do we get at it? What is it based on? And I have tried to summarize all of that. Well, I'm trying to do that for you now, but it's always been there in the back of my head, and that's how I put the course together, based on the concept of the myth of the West. I'll be saying more about myth shortly, but the myth of the West, and then here, as I have then on the PowerPoint slide, the last one, justice is the myth of the West, isn't, and this is the question I pose to all of us really, isn't this concept of justice and seeking justice itself the myth of the West? That which defines the Western tradition as opposed to other traditions of civilization, for lack of a better word, Eastern modes of thought. And that's not to say that there's no concept of justice in the East. There certainly is. But it's very a different approach than the concept of justice in the West. Now, myth, as I talked about early on, as I have used the term, is basically mythopoetical truth. Mythopoetical truth is truth that is real, that is experienced, but is not literal scientific truth. I could say a lot about this philosophically and everything else, but it's the poetic truth, the truth of, I think I used the analogy before, of the red rose. The red rose we can define scientifically, botanically, dissecting all of its parts, labeling them, showing how it all functions together. And yet doing that does not really get at the meaning of a red rose. That's what this Western civilization concept is, because as I talked about early on, there's no set thing that is Western civilization, and there's actually no set thing that is the history of this non-set thing, this Western civilization. It's an idea, it's an expression, it's an experienced reality, and therefore I say it is myth, because when we start to look for it, it all falls apart. Look for it in terms of a thing itself, because the only things that exist are artifacts. We can't go back. We can't go back and look at Western civilization in ancient Greece. We can only look at the sources, the pieces of evidence, the artifacts that are extant still today. And we have to realize that so much of that has been lost. So much of the artifacts that could have told us so much about this quote unquote past no longer exist. So we have to reconstruct our understandings, our stories, our histories of what happened, because we don't know. All we know are the things themselves. And this is why I started with problematizing it all and talking a bit about the philosophy of history and what history is based on, and what does it really mean to do history. We're not looking for something that is a known out there. This is not a course such as Algebra 1, which builds upon basic mathematics, and then goes on to Algebra 2, and then trigonometry, and then calculus, and on we go, where there's steps along the way. History is the process of seeking understanding, but it's not just created out of nothing. It's created out of the evidence that is here, that questions us. Why is this thing here? What does it mean? If we come across and find, whether we're archaeologists or anthropologists or historians, a buried bones, buried skeleton, that causes us to say, what is this? Or what was this? Who was this? How did this previous person, get to this state? When we see ruins of buildings, Colosseum in Rome, for example, we have to ask, what was that, and how did it get in the state that it's in now? What was it like when it was in its heyday, its realm of glory? When we read these things called texts, what do they mean? How do we discern and get at what this is really signifying? We know we can easily know what the words mean, relatively easily. If they're written in different languages, we have to learn how to translate those languages, which is no easy feat. But then the real question is, so what? What does it mean? Now, you've had the experience reading Plato's Republic. That is too such an artifact. The object that you have read, which is a translation, is itself an artifact. It's an artifact that signifies an artifact that signifies an artifact. And somehow what we want to know is, what was in Plato's mind? What did Plato really think? And how did that fit into the world that he lived in? We don't know those things. All we can do is look at what is before us, what we can see, what we can analyze, what we can feel. And then we interpret and surmise. Not based on nothing, but in some ways based on so little. And then we construct these accounts, these great stories. Often in the past, when I've taught this course, the final question is the myth of Western civilization is Western civilization. But the whole concept itself is a myth. Now here too, myth I use very similarly to ideology. Ideology, I think I've defined early on, as the structures that allow us to make sense of our world, whether we're aware of them or not. These are intellectual structures, cultural structures, social structures, political structures. And sometimes we are aware of those, sometimes we are not. The trick is to try to become increasingly aware of those structures, because that is what influences us and shapes how we think. And as those structures change over time, our assumptions of the way the world works, changes. Now, within these great ideological structures I've referred to here as myths, there's also other myths. We talked about the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is a myth. It's a story, it's a myth. Creation stories are myths. The Enuma Elish the creation story of ancient Babylon is a myth. Genesis accounts are myth. It doesn't mean they aren't true. They're just not literally true, and I would argue that they were not intended as being literal truth. They're mythopoetical truth. They are truths that are experienced and known, but that cannot be expressed in any other way without completely destroying the truth that is there. How do you describe love? How do you describe the impact of receiving a red rose from your beloved? Or the excitement and expectation of giving your beloved a red rose? If you start reducing that to scientific, literal, biological, social forces and developments, it kind of completely shoots the whole thing, blows it apart. But the myths I'm really getting at here are the grand myths, the ideologies. And here I've talked about the myth of Rome. And I've talked about how the myth of Rome became transformed into the myth of Christendom. And then I've talked about how the myth of Christendom became transformed into the myth of the nation state. And somehow within that whole development, we see emerging at some point, and I can't even really say when, I can speculate, but the myth of the West. Now, I asked that question too. When does civilization, which we see arising in Mesopotamia, first become uniquely and distinctively Western? It's all based on your point of observation, meaning your point of perspective, meaning your own myth, your own ideological structures of how things work. It's a problem we can't escape. There's no objective place of observation. But when we look at these great myths, myth of Rome, myth of Christendom, nation state, they were all based on the attempt to find justice and a just state in the sense of a just way of living and governing ourselves. Very different. Plato argued in the Republic that only the most just state for everyone is truly a just state. There can be justice within unjust states or only partially just states. But if we really want to have a just state and we really want to have justice, can we have justice if we don't have a just state? And can we have a just state if our rulers don't know what true justice is? And if true justice is this universal form or ideal or, Platonic forms or universal, whatever we want to call it, but if there's a reality that is justice, that is more real than any individual act of justice or manifestation of justice, that everything in this world approximates only, that true justice that is available only in the world of forms, in the world outside the cave, then only philosophers have access to that. And therefore only philosophers can be kings. But they don't want to be kings. That's the problem. They don't want to be kings. Why would they? Ruling is a very messy business. And once you've seen the light, do you really want to muck yourself up with going back into the cave? We have people who don't believe you, don't listen to you. And that Platonic view was not universally universal throughout Greece by any means, but it is one option that was there even as before Plato wrote his Republic. There was people still trying to come up with what is the best form of government for justice for all. Sparta and Athens. We have Socrates, and then Athens after losing the Peloponnesian Wars. But put Socrates to death for undermining the government, the state, by asking questions, by disagreeing, by challenging. That's where he put that up. And that is far more, his Callipolis is far more similar to Sparta than it was to Athens. Sparta, this almost authoritarian, dictatorial, militaristic society. Is that what true justice is? It's difficult. What is the price of having a truly just state? It is the good that a just state is, the most just state possible. Does that outweigh the good of individual freedoms and understandings? That's something we're still struggling with. Aristotle, Plato's student, had a different approach, a different understanding. They're still seeking that best form. And then we get Rome, and we go from Rome as a kingdom early on to the emergence of the Roman Republic, and then by the late 3rd century BCE is, in terms of extent of hegemonic control, itself an empire, but then only with Julius Caesar, then with Augustus, does it then become an empire in terms of the form of government. Was that the most just state possible? It worked, but for whom? Yes, and that question, for whom, is another point on the PowerPoint slide. So obviously I'm not going point by point here on the slide, but trying to put them all together in many ways. But the concept of the Roman Empire was that, though, that this is for the good of all. What makes for a good citizen? What makes for a just rule? What makes for being a pious, virtuous Roman? And those ideas were out there. Of course, slaves were excluded. The plebeian class was not given a lot of consideration, because the people who are defining the questions are often taking themselves as the example, as the standard. So therefore, they're also excluding people. And then when Christianity comes along, Christianity has a different form of justice, true justice. And when Rome becomes Christian, that's a huge transformation. And then we begin to see the emergence eventually of the myth of Christendom. Now, Augustine of Hippo argued that there's only true justice in heaven, in the city of God, in the heavenly Jerusalem. And the function of government in this world is simply to limit human sin. Now, the problem is a state without at least the concept of true justice, as Augustine says, is simply a band of robbers, because then it defines justice based on the views of those in power who are defining it based on their own good, which gets back to the corrupt forms of government that Aristotle saw, based on the good of the rulers, not the good of all. And yet, how do you define the good of all? That's really the problem, isn't it? What is that common good? So the whole concept of Christendom was influenced not only by the myth of Rome, because it just takes over the myth of Rome, but then it Christianizes it and sees it as this divinely inspired and proclaimed empire, which Augustus had put forward himself as Rome, divinely prophesied, sanctioned empire. And yet, in the course of the 16th century, that all kind of breaks down. This one unified vision. And we have, instead of Christendom, these nation states arising where they are the ones that are the locus of justice, the locus of reality, the basis for the ideology of their inhabitants, of their people, to make sense of the world they're in. So the myth of the nation state, which doesn't exist, France does not exist, England does not exist, except as an idea. Yes, there are boundaries or political boundaries, but that's not the same as England or France. The empire is kind of a different development. Engels said, they had their chance, they blew it. They were backwards because they didn't unify until 1870 or 71. Whereas France and England became centralized monarchies with concepts. But once you start to believe, whether as Christendom or as individual countries, states, France, England, that you are right, that you are the best, that you embody justice, especially in a Christian sense, that you embody Christian justice, that gives you legitimation for, in the positive sense, saving the world. Or in the negative sense, using that as a justification for your own exploitation of others, which we see beginning with the Age of Exploration on into colonialization and the emergence of the world system, where these slave traders, as well as Cortez over with the Aztecs in Mexico, who was just doing brutally horrible things to them, but they were all doing it in the name of saving souls, divine justice, divine truth, even though it was benefiting themselves. Or they were simply using that as the justification. We can't get into their hearts and minds. We have to look at how they represented it to themselves. And it's both. These motivations that today we see as very distinct, they somehow kept together. So there's two sides of the same coin. And that's something I've stressed and tried to stress throughout this course, that motivations that we see as contradictory within the ideology, the mindset, so to speak, of the time, and this goes throughout from the very beginnings all the way through the end of this course anyway, we're seen as simply one and the same. Which doesn't mean it's right. This course in history is not about what is right or not what is true in that absolute Platonic sense. It's about how did people come to understand their world and how did they describe it and justify it to themselves? What are the understandings of the past that can help us understand how things happened based on the sources that are still extant? That's the problem we have. We have contradictory pieces of evidence. How do we understand that? How do we account for that? Memory is there to remind us that what's in our mind, number one, is always in the present, as I've argued. And it's not really an artifact. Our brain is an artifact, but our memory is not. We remember things. We forget things. We remember things only partially correctly. We remember things the way we want to remember them and everything else. Memory is a problem. And yet history is memory. What's the check on it? The artifacts. It all comes back down to the artifacts. And that's the issue of history as science. Analyzing the extant things that exist. What are they? What does this say? And then on that basis, and on that basis only, can we really then move on to saying, what does this mean? What did it mean for them? What does it mean for us? That for whom question is extremely important. Whether we're doing history, whether we're talking about justice or whatever. Because if it's talking about justice, justice for whom? On what basis? You've read The Republic. At least you're supposed to have. And so most of it is just trying to come up with an understanding of what is justice. Socrates is asking questions. What is just? And there's problems. Problems coming up with it. He keeps asking questions away, frustrating his friends who are there. They finally get upset and say, well, you didn't define it, Socrates. He comes up with the allegory of the metals and the myth of Ur, the allegory of the cave, and then the myth of Ur. How is it all going to work and function? It's a problem, and it's still a problem that we struggle with today. And that's struggling to find a just life, a just way of living, what in classical Latin was referred to as the blessed life, de beata vita. So many treatises written before Christianity. And then with Christianity, that de beata vita, the blessed life, became then a Christian understanding thereof. That is what we seek. So often, beata vita has been translated as the happy life and the happiness. Happiness is pleasure, is it? Momentarily, but is that true happiness? That was Augustine's dilemma with what I call Augustine's drunk. What's true happiness? He says, hey, the drunken beggar he's happier. I'm miserable, but I would choose to be me rather than him. Isn't that insane? Augustine was trying to seek happiness, peace, understanding, rest. Isn't that what Western tradition has been? The ongoing attempt to find quote-unquote happiness for oneself and one's friends and one's country and one's family, etc. Whether it's family or immediate biological family, or whether it's the family that was Christendom itself. And is it just to find that happiness at the expense of others? Well, that certainly has been the case all along, from the very beginning of civilization, with this distinction between us and them. We can be happy, but you can't. At least not the same as we are. You can't have what we have. And we will keep you from doing it, from getting it. So buzz off, go find yourself. You barbarians, you are not like us. This dichotomy of us versus them, there from the very beginnings of civilization as such, it's developed in the West and developed in the East too. That allow us to demarcate ourselves from the other. And somehow that leads in and of itself to a lack of peace, a lack of rest, a lack of security, a lack of happiness. If you're not secure, how can you be happy? Oh, let's just go conquer them and we'll take care of it. We're always seeking that which we desire. And we've never found it. Except in an ephemeral way. Augustine's drunk. We go out and get drunk, whether that is winning a football game and getting drunk or whatever. Or, winning an election, whatever it might be. We think, there, we've got it now. But have we? And for whom? Now, that's kind of what this whole thing has been about. Trying to come to an understanding of this Western tradition of seeking justice that will make possible the blessed life, the happy life for all. It's a dream. It's a myth. That's what I talk about here. I'm talking about justice as the myth of the West. Which doesn't mean it's not real. The seeking has been very real. The seeking of justice has been very real. The fact that we haven't found it. Now, maybe some people have here and there. I'm not talking about the super wealthy. I'm talking actually about the mystics and the monks and the nuns, the hermits, the saints, who have been able, somewhat very much like the Eastern tradition of enlightenment, to remove themselves from the suffering of life, to accept the suffering of life, and to stop the ongoing, incessant looking for nirvana. Because nirvana is not something out there to be sought. And yet in the West, we keep seeking it that way, whether we call it nirvana, whether we call it true justice, whether we call it, the kingdom of God, whatever you want to call it. Collectively, the Western tradition has simply been the long one, always changing and developing of how do we find what we desire for all of us, our group. That's the problem. If we have a small group, maybe we could come up with something. But then as that group grows, expands, incorporates others, there are tensions. How do we deal with that? That's basically the history of the West when it comes down to it. And that is what your final exam is getting at. How do you put it all together? How do you come to an understanding of whatever this is that we call Western civilization? Now, I'll be talking more about preparing for the exam in the next lecture, specifically in terms of the question that is posed to you. But this is my attempt now, for the last time I get, really, to try to say, let's look at where we've been since, mid or late August. What have we seen? What have we gone through? And where are we ending up? And what is it all about? Because that is so the important part. That's what I want you to leave with this course. A changed understanding, to reflect on your own attempt to come to an understanding of the world in which we find ourselves. That's what this is about. And the influences that have affected the structures of your own myths, your own ideologies, your own worldviews, your own assumptions of how things work. To always question them, which does not mean they are wrong, just means you should question them to see what they're based on. To come to a deeper understanding, a broader understanding of whatever this thing is that we call Western civilization, which here I've called the myth, which again, for me, does not mean that it's not very, very real. And that's my course. I'll be back with the final talk about preparing for the exam. Good luck, and I'll see you again shortly. But I hope this will actually also be, you can use as preparation for preparing for the exam, so to speak, because this is kind of summing it all up. Okay, thank you so much, and I'll see you one more time anyway. Okay, bye-bye.